This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Becki Gray from the John Locke Foundation, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, and political consultant Brad Crone. Well, thank you for tuning into our show. This week we're going to discuss distressing financial problems with the state health plan. We'll ask if it's still true that what goes around comes around, and we're going to ask our panel to tell us the biggest issue facing our state. And as always, we'll ask them to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. State Treasurer Dale Falwell, whose department administers the state health plan, says that recent reports show that expenses will once again exceed available funding for the fiscal year ending June 30th, and unfunded liabilities now exceed $42 billion. But the news got even worse. Superior Court Judge Edward Wilson ruled recently that the state had broken its promises to retirees by charging them premiums for their health insurance and would have to restore payments made to many. Treasurer Falwell estimates this could cost as much as $100 million. Chris, one of our faithful viewers, and we love to get viewer mail, recently wrote me asking why our legislators shouldn't take some of the surplus funds this year and make a down payment on that unfunded liability, or put another way, why continue to stockpile savings when we have this big debt staring us down the barrel?
Well, it's a good question from a faithful viewer. I think that this is a very complicated problem. It's going to take a long-term solution, and clearly some of the state's money is going to have to be set aside as part of that, and this would have been a good year to start. We had a big one-time budget surplus, which is you can't spend it on ongoing things. I think we need to build up our savings account, but we also need to be paying off liabilities. We also need to be making more investments at the same time. It's also interesting that we view the judge's ruling as a huge problem. It's a financial problem, but if the law says that these retirees were treated unfairly, we shouldn't be lamenting the fact that we're going to have to pay them what they're owed.
Well, he said what happened was that we had broken their employment contract.
That's right. That's what I'm saying. They were treated unfairly.
Prior to 2005, if you'd worked 5 years or more for the state, at age 65, you got your health insurance free, and now we changed that.
Well, yes. Now, there are two things. Number one, I actually not sure I understand the viewer's question. Saving money is literally how you offset unfunded liabilities. You can't go pay the bonds down. There aren't any bonds. It's not an explicit debt you can buy down. The way that you prepare for an unfunded liability is to save money. So it's not an alternative. It is literally the solution. Now, as to the question of the decision that Ed Wilson did, a friend of mine, I think he was bound by precedent of some previous cases that the state Supreme Court settled. I think those cases were incorrectly decided. We don't have formal contracts between state employees and the state. A current legislature cannot bind a future legislature's budgetary actions. So I'm not sure I buy this logic, but it is not the Superior Court judge's fault. This is what the Supreme Court ruled decades ago, and that's what we're going to have to live with.
I. Beverly Lake evidently thought it was because he was one of the plaintiffs in this case. There's no question about it. So, Becki, where is the state going to find $100 million to pay this off?
I think they'll be lucky if it's only $100 million
well, it's
to pay
not.
this
It's
off
just,
to begin.
It's just paying off the previous premiums, and then it goes forward.
Right. So I think $100 million is a very, very conservative estimate with this lawsuit and the other things. And really to Chris's point, I mean, we ought to be thinking about these are contracts that we made. It's an obligation with state employees. This is deferred compensation, is the way that it was referred to. This is what they are owed, and I think it's important to put that money aside to begin to do this. I don't know what that's going to look like if the final decision out of the courts is that the state has to pay all of this back at one time, as they did in the Falconberry case and the Bailey case years ago.
Yeah, the Bailey case cost the state a lot of money. Brad, do you think this decision is going to be appealed? And if so, what are its chances?
Oh, yeah, no, you just heard the line of argumentation from Mr. Hood. Yeah, it's going to be appealed. The Tooth Fairy is not going to show up with $100 million, so the legislature's flat going to appeal it and hope for maybe a different outcome at the Supreme Court. Well, I think on the grounds
gonna
that
make this argument.
I mean, I think the grounds could be, I was a state employee. I remember when I went to work for the state of North Carolina, it was clearly and explicitly explained, you probably aren't going to be making market wages, but here's one of the benefits. The benefit is you work 5 years, you get your life,
And
your
that was to
health.
attract people to come to work for the state. I mean, that was the whole premise of it, was those deferred compensation that, you didn't get the you didn't get the upfront, but you got the benefits.
And Chris, I guess going back to you, the question is, why we've known about this unfunded liability. Gosh, I remember years ago we were talking about $20 billion, $25 billion. Dale Falwell was on the show at the beginning of the year, and he said it was like 30 or 35 billion. Now he says it's $42 billion. Why hadn't the legislature done anything?
Well, it's almost such a big, I think people perceive it as such a big problem they can't figure out the best way to address it.
But
so
it's
they just
only
move on.
growing.
Well, I understand that, but politicians run in 2-year terms.
Yeah, so this is absolutely related to the decision that Judge Wilson put down. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't think about this as a sort of an obligation, the equivalent of, I'm just not sure we should think of it as a legally enforceable contract. But if it is, I'm here to tell you that there was a disaster coming with this retiree health benefit, because I think that the likely solution is some combination of saving money to pay it and some increased spending and some repudiation of it. And if you can't do the latter part of it, we're in big trouble. We would have to save more than $1 billion a year just for this one thing, which
But
we're not
Brad,
going to
all
do.
the solutions I've heard so far mostly put the funding for this unfunded, or at least getting the balance the books currently in the state health plan on the backs of the state employees.
Absolutely, and that's a real big problem. And new employees coming on aren't going to have access to a defined benefit plan. It's a real big problem.
But this is something, too, to think of when we talk about, we're getting ready to go through this budget process. Part of that budget is, do we increase the number of state employees? Do we add to the roles? This is a real consideration. We're talking about growing government, making it bigger. These are long-term commitments. These are serious commitments that we owe these folks. And as you add people to the roles, there's going to be more and more obligations, and it's something to stop and think about.
Well, who created those jobs? It
Yes.
wasn't the state employees.
Now, another way to
Right.
think
It was
about this,
legislature.
Right.
this may be an
Yeah.
odd thing to hear me say, but another way to think about this is it is going to be easier in the long run to give pay increases to state employees. That is immediately budgeted.
It's cheaper, yeah.
The money is already out the door. You're not
Right.
going to promise some vague, we're going to give you deferred compensation in 20 years. That is something you can't really ultimately force legislators to do anything about. I'd rather pay them cash now rather than promise them benefits later that we don't correctly budget for.
General Motors sort of got in problems with this, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And does the legislature at some point in time in the future say, we cannot afford it, we can't pay for it, we got to find a way out?
I think
Which is where they are now.
I think that's, I was getting ready to say, I think they're
We're
exactly
coming to
there
that
right now.
end of the road.
They're between a rock and a hard place. Have you signed up to receive our free weekly email newsletter Spin Cycle? It's easy. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up. And while you're there, you can view the latest NC Spin show, get video footage and perspective pieces not seen anywhere else, and read my weekly column. So get more balanced debate from the Old North State at ncspin.com, NCSpin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NCSpinTweets. When we come back, we're going to ask, does what goes around still come around?
NC Spin will return after these messages.
North Carolina has over 300,000 government retirees who depend on their pension. Since the 2008 recession, retirees have seen little or no cost of living increase, while inflation has increased more than 14%. Investing in our retirees is good for the economy. Every pension dollar generates more than $2 for your local economy. Tell your local and state elected official it's time to take care of our retirees and fund a cost of living increase.
Learn more at ncrgea.com.
Every year, North Carolina patients undergo 635,000 same-day surgeries. 72% of these surgeries are performed in our highest-cost hospital facilities, adding as much as $2,000 to every procedure. The state's outdated Certificate of Need law prevents competition from lower-cost, higher-quality same-day surgery centers, inflating healthcare costs and limiting patient choice. Tell state lawmakers it's time to lower healthcare costs now. It's time to make a simple fix to an outdated law. increasing patient choice and lowering healthcare costs now. You can help. Visit reformconnow.com and tell lawmakers it's time for a simple fix to an outdated law. It's time to lower healthcare costs now.
In 2011, our farmers asked for 6,500 seasonal workers. Only 7 Americans showed up to work those jobs. Immigrant farm workers aren't stealing American jobs. To say otherwise ignores the facts. When farmers don't have enough skilled workers, crops go unharvested and farmers lose money. Consumers face fewer choices and higher prices. This is not acceptable. Tell Congress it's time to fix our broken immigration system.
12,000 North Carolina veterans are uninsured with no options to buy health insurance. They fought for us. Now let's fight for them. Let's create a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured.
To learn more, visit careforcarolina.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
Longtime reporter and columnist Paul O'Connor recently wrote a piece in which he asked if it's still true that what goes around comes around. He began by remembering a time back in the 1980s when the Democrats held total control of the legislature and virtually ignored Republicans at all turns. O'Connor writes that Republicans remembered that experience and are essentially applying the same treatment to Democrats today. Brad, let's assume Democrats are somehow able to take control of state government once again. Do you think they've gotten the message and that they'll be more open to being bipartisan, or are they going to repeat the same thing all over again?
Well, making the assumption that the Democrats are going to take control over at some period in the future is a very big assumption based on the political apparatus that we've seen out of Goodwin House. I would hope so, Tom. I've worked in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania where the Democrats up there did learn. And I mean, every 2 years, 4 years, the House would switch, the Senate would switch. They worked out a ranking system so that the Democrats would maintain a seniority process on the committees. You know, you can't go the pot calling the kettle black and get anything done. You're not serving your citizens when you do that.
Becki, currently the Republican leadership doesn't seem to believe that that pendulum is going to swing and they will no longer be in control. Why wouldn't they be willing to be more inclusive of Democrats when history says that it's probably going to happen?
Well, you know, as you mentioned, they are very secure in their position. I mean, the Senate has got to be at the high water mark, and the House only lost, I think, a net of 2 seats in this last election. So they're feeling pretty secure with that. You know, being in charge comes with advantages, and it's controlling all the committees and it's controlling everything. I mean, I think that to be honest with you, there needs to be a nicer manners at the General Assembly. But for the most part, whoever's in charge gets to make these decisions, and it does. What comes around comes around.
Yeah. Chris, you've been watching this for a long time. My dad served in the legislature back in the 70s for about 10 years, and I know the Democrats were in control, and I suspect that there was probably a lot of this uneven treatment, but there seemed to be more collegiality and more willingness to be inclusive of Republicans. Is that just my imagination?
No, I think that's probably true. Although, you know, back in the 80s, we had a guy named Billy Watkins who stood up on the House floor and took pork barrel spending away from one Republican who complained about it. But that led to an overthrow of the people who ran the State House, with NC Spin panelist Joe Mavretic leading it. And I think things got a lot better. What I don't understand about the current environment, Republicans do have a stranglehold on the House and the Senate. So there's no reason to do things in the middle of the night. There's no reason to do things in secret. They could have all the meetings they want and open. They know they're going to win. Why not let everybody have their say? And you diffuse all this anger that I think keeps building up and sets the stage for when.
Is there really anger, or is it just is it just inside the belt line? Does anybody else in the state care, John?
To some extent, yes. People don't follow the ins and outs of the legislature like weirdos around this table do, but they get a sense of this, and I think Chris is onto something, but maybe in a different way. Y'all are assuming that the Republicans are doing this to the Democrats in the legislature because they feel like they're in charge forever. I think the opposite is the case. Back in the 70s and 80s, when the Democrats were so nice to Republicans, that's because Republicans were just little pests that occasionally would circle around. They really weren't, that no one ever thought they would challenge the Democratic control of the General Assembly, ever. And so they could be somewhat more magnanimous, the Democrats felt like. Now, some of them weren't, and there was some mean things that were done, but that's because they never feared losing power. The Republicans today, even though they have supermajorities, they haven't had them all that long. And some of them remember being in the minority, and they want to keep the Democrats down.
And they're trying to make hay while the sun shines. I think that's a good point.
John makes a valid point. 72 gubernatorial election, it was a fight between liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats. Skipper Bowles versus Pat Taylor. Yeah. I mean, that was the fight. The fight in the legislature when the Democrats had control was the fight between...
And there were periods of time in the 70s, Tom, when your father served in the Senate where there was one Republican.
He was actually in the House.
But it's worth remembering, Democrats, Jesse Helms was a Democrat at one point, so it wasn't as if all the Democrats in power were far left liberals at the time. The state was still very conservative.
Here's what I hear a lot of time when I, and others around the panel here, talk about this. We criticize Republicans for not having hearings, for not having a normal process. And the pushback I often get is, you just don't get it, you're naive. I'm here to tell you that most legislatures around the country go back, eventually the turn, maybe not in Vermont, maybe not in Hawaii, but eventually things change. You've got to have some common sense here. It is absolutely the case that you could accomplish what you want and have a more normal process. It would be better. It would make the Republicans look better. It would be good for them.
But who was it, Becki said that common sense isn't?
Well,
very common.
Good point. But I think too, it's important. I mean, you hear about this and people complain about it, and those who feel like they're being mistreated complain and complain loudly. But when you're down there, most of the issues, most of the bills that are voted on, most of the committee discussion, there is an exchange with all members of both parties participating in this, deciding, debating, all of those things. 90% of the bills that are taken up are bipartisan. Most of them are by big majority in favor, usually, of the particular bills. But there's a handful of things that are really divisive, that are really partisan. Election law is one of them. The budget, but there are things in this budget with teacher pay increases, state employee pay increases, some other things, savings, tax cuts that everybody is on board with.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to ask the panel, what's the biggest issue facing North Carolina?
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I am Kathy Merritt, and I have worked at Cherry Hospital, a state-run psychiatric facility, for 27 years. Like 1 in 3 state employees, I still earn less than $31,000 a year because we haven't had a decent pay raise in years. When I started at 20 years old, that was a wonderful thing to have a state job. That's not the case anymore. And I love the job that I do. I just can't make it on what I do. It's not right. I work very hard. I love what I do, but it's difficult when you're not getting paid for what you do. You can't raise 2 kids on the salary that I had and not work another job and not apply for food stamps and not apply for medical benefits for your children. Tell your legislators to support a pay increase for state employees. Learn more at scenic.org.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
Recently, I had lunch with Leslie Boney, the new executive director of the Institute for Emerging Issues, and we were talking about possible themes for future emerging issues forums that group stages each year. The question he posed was, what's the biggest issue facing our state? I want to go around the panel and ask each of you, how would you answer that question? What is the biggest issue facing North Carolina, John?
Well, it's easy to say education, and that's what I'll do because I always take the easy way out. But in particular, I'm going to talk about personnel and technology. The reason why this is an important issue is obvious. It's the single biggest business that the state government is in, and even if you include charter schools and private schools and homeschools and the entire sector of education that is growing, what you'll see is that questions of how do you evaluate and how do you compensate both teachers and principals, and how do you use technology effectively to get productivity gains in education. This is the big issue facing North Carolina, the United States, the developed world.
Becki Gray, biggest issue facing North Carolina.
I think that it is the urban-rural, suburban divide that we have in North Carolina, and it manifests itself on several different levels. One is from an economic aspect that, you know, with the loss of manufacturing, with the loss of jobs in the rural areas, with more people moving towards the urban areas, and we see it in education funding, we see it in transportation and infrastructure funding, and lots of things, and I'm not sure what the answer is.
Brad Crone, what's the biggest issue?
Ditto, she stole my thunder. I would say the urban divide. When you have 2,000 people a month moving into Mecklenburg County and Wake County versus losing 80 people in Bertie County, it's a real big issue, and we've got to figure out an economic model that will drive their economy.
Chris?
Well, I have a slightly different take, although it's in the same neighborhood. You can call it income inequality. You can call it people who were being left behind, who didn't participate in the Carolina comeback. We still have hundreds of thousands of people in North Carolina who used to work in factories, who used to work on, have to grow tobacco, used to do all these things, who are struggling, who don't have health care, who aren't being taken care of. They don't live. Some of them live in urban areas. Most of them don't.
I was getting ready to say, I'm kind of surprised nobody mentioned health care. I think
I think it's this whole big umbrella of how do you make sure that everybody. North Carolina has some very prosperous areas, and I don't think we should redistribute all the wealth in North Carolina, but I think we should figure out a way to make sure that everybody shares in our prosperity, at least with the opportunity.
Notice he didn't say redistribute all the wealth.
Yeah.
Just 95% of it, but not all of it.
No, let's give all the tax breaks to the millionaires. That'll help the poor folks.
All right, I'm surprised nobody mentioned infrastructure.
I think, you know, when you talk about the urban-rural divide, I mean, that's really what you're talking about. Healthcare, access in those rural areas. How are you going to get it there? How do you do it with technology? Do you expand that in telemedicine? With infrastructure, is that the way that you connect these areas? Do you invest more money in roads and infrastructure so that everything is connected?
$4 billion highway, I-95, it's going to cost to fix it, but you had 5 people killed in a wreck 2 weeks ago in Robeson County. I mean, we've got to spend the money to fix our interstates.
And nobody mentioned leadership, because I think that's a big issue in North Carolina too. Interesting conversation. Well, when we come back after these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina has over 300,000 government retirees who depend on their pension. Since the 2008 recession, retirees have seen little or no cost of living increase, while inflation has increased more than 14%. Investing in our retirees is good for the economy. Every pension dollar generates more than $2 for your local economy. Tell your local and state elected official it's time to take care of our retirees and fund a cost of living increase.
Learn more at ncrgea.com.
cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
Our state has more than 300,000 with no options for health insurance. 63% are in working families, one illness away from disaster. Let's create a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured.
To learn more, visit careforcarolina.com.
I am Kathy Merritt, and I have worked at Cherry Hospital, a state-run psychiatric facility, for 27 years. Like 1 in 3 state employees, I still earn less than $31,000 a year because we haven't had a decent pay raise in years. When I started at 20 years old, that was a wonderful thing to have a state job. That's not the case anymore. And I love the job that I do. I just can't make it on what I do. It's not right. I work very hard. I love what I do, but it's difficult when you're not getting paid for what you do. You can't raise 2 kids on the salary that I had and not work another job and not apply for food stamps and not apply for medical benefits for your children. Tell your legislators to support a pay increase for state employees. Learn more at scenic.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Brad Crone, start with you.
Well, Tom, I've always been an advocate for our court system and the adequate funding for our court system. A report came out last week from the National Center on Judicial Salaries showing that North Carolina Supreme Court justices and our Superior Court justices and district court judges are paid 41st in the nation when it comes to an aggregate schedule of salaries. The Court of Appeals were 33rd. Our neighboring states far better than us.
Wow. Chris Fitzsimon, tell us something we don't know.
It's never too early to talk about elections, and I think it's a long shot, but the Democrats have a list of targeted congressional seats in the United States that they think if everything breaks their way, and Donald
4
Trump's
in North Carolina.
Popularity, and
Yeah.
George Holding, I think, is the one that most of them are focusing on. In the Triangle, it's definitely a Republican district, but it's an urban district largely, and in the right year, with the right circumstance, if Donald Trump's popularity continues to crater, the Democrats have him on their hit list.
They got Ted Budd, they've got Pittenger, they've got who else? They're going after anyway. Yeah. Well, there were 4 of them, I thought. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
People may have a hard time wrapping their heads around this, but over the last couple of school years, North Carolina's public school enrollment has declined.
Interesting.
Now that includes charter schools. So if you disaggregate, you'll see the charter schools have grown rapidly, and district-run public schools haven't seen very much enrollment growth in 5 years.
All right, Becki Gray, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, during this recent discussion of raise the age, there was a lot of discussion about the different categories of felonies. There were conversations about over-criminalization and really going in and looking at our criminal code, recodifying all of that. There are real serious efforts here in the General Assembly. We may see a commission appointed that is really going to take a serious look at our North Carolina criminal code.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read my weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Join us next week when we're going to discuss the House budget, and we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.